Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking at some pretty major changes happening over at the Justice Department, specifically their Civil Rights Division, and the potential impact on police reform agreements in places like Minneapolis, and Louisville.
Yeah.
Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. These are cities that have obviously been dealing with some very high-profile cases of police misconduct, so the stakes are pretty high.
Yeah, what's really striking here is that the Trump administration has basically put a freeze on pretty much all new civil rights investigations, cases, settlements. Now, it's not totally uncommon to see some kind of shift when a new administration comes in, but the scale of this freeze is really something we haven't seen before. It's not just about changing priorities. It's pretty much shutting down a whole division.
So this doesn't just affect future cases then, right? It could actually impact agreements that were already put in place during the Biden administration.
Exactly. Like the agreements in Minneapolis and Louisville, for example, those were meant to bring about some serious changes in how the police operate. Damon Hewitt, who's the president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, he called this a dereliction of duty by the Justice Department. And I think that really sums up how serious this is.
It's a huge difference from what we saw under the previous administration. I mean, under Biden, the Justice Department launched 12 investigations into law enforcement agencies. 9 of those actually ended up with findings. This administration, though, they didn't launch any similar investigations during their first term.
And their campaign rhetoric was all about tougher policing. They even talked about bringing back things like stop and frisk, and so this shift in the Justice Department isn't exactly a surprise, but it has some pretty big implications.
Yeah, this goes beyond legal processes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We're talking about people's lives in these cities, people who are looking for justice and some kind of lasting change in their police departments.
Absolutely. And this raises a really important question. What happens to those communities if the federal government pulls back from police reform?
It's almost like taking years of work and progress and just hitting the reset button. A lot of these agreements haven't even been fully implemented yet.
That's right. Like in Louisville and Minneapolis, the consent decrees there were just waiting for a judge's final approval. Now it's not clear what's going to happen to them.
So basically with this new directive, the Justice Department is saying they have the power to review and maybe even change these agreements to fit their current priorities.
Right. And given this administration's track record on law enforcement and what they promised during their campaign, this is definitely a big concern for anyone who's pushing for serious police reform.
And it goes beyond just police reform, right? This freeze impacts a whole range of civil rights investigations and cases.
Yeah, definitely. This memo basically tells the Civil Rights Division to stop everything new. Don't file any new complaints. Don't get involved in ongoing cases, not even issue statements.
This feels like a big step back for civil rights enforcement.
It definitely has people worried, especially those who are depending on the Justice Department to protect their rights. It makes you wonder, what happens to the people who are counting on these investigations to bring them justice? What can communities do if they were hoping for real changes in how their police departments operate?
That's a really good point. We're talking about potentially undoing years of work, legal battles, community organizing, all aimed at fixing these deep-rooted problems.
Exactly. And it's not just about police reform either. Think about voting rights, fair housing, equal access to education. These are all areas where the Justice Department has historically played a crucial role in protecting civil rights.
It seems like this shift could embolden people who oppose these kinds of reforms and maybe even discourage communities from turning to the federal government for help in the future.
It's a real possibility, and it raises questions about the future of civil rights enforcement in this country. Will we see grassroots movements taking on more responsibility for fighting for these rights? Will there be a greater reliance on legal challenges brought by independent organizations? These are the questions we need to be thinking about.
And let's not forget the human impact of all of this.
Yeah.
The individuals and families directly affected by these cases, especially victims of police brutality. They're facing even more uncertainty now.
Absolutely. Their fight for justice just got even harder. They might have to rely more on civil lawsuits and public pressure to hold people accountable.
The Justice Department's actions have really far-reaching consequences. It's not just about legal outcomes. It's about the message it sends to communities, to law enforcement, to the world, about America's commitment to civil rights and equality.
Exactly. It shows how fragile progress can be. The pendulum can swing back and forth. And right now we're seeing a major shift in how we approach civil rights enforcement.
And this brings up another important point. If local efforts to reform police departments don't have the support of the federal government, how effective can they really be?
It's a valid concern. Consent decrees are powerful tools for change, but they need oversight. They need enforcement and the threat of legal action to make sure people comply. If the Justice Department isn't willing to do that anymore, it could undermine the whole process.
We've talked a lot about police reform, but as you mentioned earlier, this freeze affects other civil rights areas too. Can you talk a little bit about how it might impact, say, voting rights cases?
Sure. Sure. The Justice Department has always played a key role in fighting against discriminatory voting practices, especially in states with a history of disenfranchisement. They filed lawsuits against states that put in restrictive voter ID laws or engaged in gerrymandering to weaken the voting power of minority communities. With this freeze in place, those efforts could be seriously limited.
So we could potentially see some of the progress made on protecting voting rights rolled back.
It's a possibility we have to consider. This policy shift could embolden some states to pass even more restrictive voting laws, knowing they're less likely to face legal challenges from the federal government.
This brings us back to the question of what happens next. How should communities and activists respond to this change in the Justice Department's approach?
They might need to rely more on local efforts, grassroots organizing, and legal challenges that don't involve the federal government. We might see a resurgence in community-led initiatives to address issues like police misconduct, voting rights, and other civil rights violations.
It's a reminder that the fight for civil rights never really ends, and that progress isn't always a straight line.
Absolutely. It takes constant vigilance, advocacy, and a willingness to hold those in power accountable. This shift in the Justice Department's approach is a setback for sure, but it's not the end of the story.
It's a call to action for all of us to get more involved in protecting these fundamental rights. We can't just assume that the federal government will always be there to champion these causes.
Exactly. We've seen throughout history that progress on civil rights often comes from the ground up. It's the tireless work of activists, organizers, and everyday citizens that forces change and holds institutions accountable.
Maybe this shift in the Justice Department's approach will actually energize communities and lead to a resurgence of grassroots movements. We could see a wave of local initiatives, legal challenges, and public pressure campaigns, all aimed at tackling these issues head-on.
It's certainly possible. We've already seen it happen in recent years with movements like Black Lives Matter and the fight for voting rights. Communities are realizing that they can't rely solely on the federal government to protect their rights.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of civil rights in this country. Whether it's through advocacy, education, or supporting organizations on the front lines, we can make a difference.
This is a pivotal moment. The decisions made today will have a huge impact on the lives of millions of people. The fight for civil rights is far from over. It's a constant struggle that requires our unwavering commitment and action.
We've covered a lot of ground in this discussion. We've explored the implications of the Justice Department's shift in priorities, the potential consequences for police reform and other civil rights areas, and the call to action for individuals and communities to step up and fill the void.
Yeah, it really has a lot of people feeling anxious and uncertain, especially folks who rely on the Justice Department, to protect their rights. It really raises the question, like, what happens to those people who are depending on these investigations, to bring some justice? What about the communities who are hoping for some real changes in their police departments? What recourse do they have now?
That's a good point. We're talking about potentially unraveling years of work here. Legal battles, community organizing, all that effort to try to fix these deep-seated systemic problems.
Exactly. And it goes way beyond just police reform. I mean, think about the impact this could have on voting rights, fair housing, educational equity. All areas where the Justice Department has played a crucial role historically in safeguarding civil rights.
It does feel like this shift could give a boost to those who oppose these reforms, and maybe even make communities think twice before they turn to the federal government for help in the future.
Yeah, that's a very real concern, unfortunately. It brings up some really important questions about the future of civil rights enforcement in this country. Like, will we see a sort of resurgence of grassroots movements taking on the burden of fighting for these rights? Or will there be a greater reliance on legal challenges through independent organizations? These are questions we need to grapple with moving forward.
And we can't forget the human cost here, the individuals and families directly affected by these cases, especially victims of police brutality. They're facing even more uncertainty now.
Absolutely. Their path to justice is even more challenging. They might have to lean even more heavily on civil litigation and public pressure to hold those responsible accountable.
These actions by the Justice Department have some serious consequences. It's not just about the legal outcomes, but the message it sends to communities, to law enforcement, to the whole world, about how committed America is to civil rights and equality.
Exactly. It really underscores how fragile progress can be. The pendulum swings back and forth, and we're witnessing a pretty significant shift in the approach to civil rights enforcement right now.
It makes you wonder, if these local efforts to reform police departments don't have the backing of the federal government, how effective can they really be?
It's a legitimate concern. Consent decrees, while they can be powerful tools for change, they don't just automatically implement themselves. They require oversight and enforcement, and the threat of legal action to ensure compliance. If the Justice Department is no longer willing to play that role, it could seriously jeopardize the whole process.
We focused a lot on police reform, But you mentioned earlier that this freeze affects other civil rights areas too. Can you expand a bit on how this might impact, for example, voting rights cases?
Sure. The Justice Department has a long history of challenging discriminatory voting practices, particularly in states that have a history of disenfranchisement. They've brought lawsuits against states that have implemented things like restrictive voter ID laws or engaged in gerrymandering, which is basically manipulating electoral districts to dilute the voting power of minority communities. With this freeze in effect, those efforts could be significantly scaled back.
So there's a chance we could see some of the progress made in protecting voting rights reversed.
It's a possibility we have to consider. This change in policy could embolden some states to implement even more restrictive voting laws, knowing that they're less likely to face legal challenges from the federal government.
So circling back, what happens now? How should communities and activists respond to this change in approach from the Justice Department?
Well, they may need to become more self-reliant, focus on local efforts, grassroots organizing, and legal challenges that don't depend on the federal government. We might see a resurgence of community-led initiatives to address things like police misconduct, voting rights, and other civil rights violations.
It's a stark reminder that the fight for civil rights is a marathon, not a sprint, and that progress isn't always a straight line.
You got it. It requires constant vigilance, advocacy, and holding those in power accountable. This shift in the Justice Department's approach is definitely a step back, but it's not the end of the road.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call for all of us to really step up and protect these fundamental rights.
Right.
We can't just sit back and assume the federal government will always be there to fight for these causes.
Absolutely. I mean, history shows us that progress on civil rights often comes from the bottom up. It's the hard work of activists and organizers, everyday people, that forces change and holds institutions accountable.
Maybe this shift at the Justice Department will actually be a catalyst for communities. It could spark a new wave of grassroots movements. We could see more local initiatives, legal challenges, public pressure campaigns, all focused on directly addressing these issues.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. I mean, look at what we've seen recently with movements like Black Lives Matter and the push for voting rights. Communities are recognizing they can't just depend on the federal government to protect their rights.
It really highlights how important it is for each of us to be involved in shaping the future of civil rights in this country. Whether it's through advocacy, education, supporting organizations on the front lines, we can all make a difference.
This is a crucial moment, there's no doubt about it. The decisions made today will have a huge impact on millions of people. The fight for civil rights is far from over. It's a constant battle that demands our ongoing commitment and action.
Well, we've covered a lot today. We looked at what this shift in priorities of the Justice Department really means, the potential consequences for police reform and other areas of civil rights, and the call to action for individuals and communities to step up and fill the gap.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue with a lot of implications. We'll definitely keep a close eye on this story and let you know about any new developments.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the evolving landscape of civil rights in America. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time.